Today, when people talk about getting rich in America, they usually think of Wall Street, stocks, banks, credit, real estate, retirement accounts, investment apps, a number on a screen. But for most of American history, wealth did not look like that. It looked like land, a farm, a general store, a shipping route, a herd of cattle, a railroad contract, a gold claim, an oil well, a factory. A piece of city property bought before the city exploded around it. Before modern finance took over, getting rich in America meant controlling something real: land, goods, labor, transport, credit, or information. So how did Americans get rich before Wall Street became the center of wealth? The answer goes back further than most people realize, and it reveals something important about how wealth actually works. For the first 100 years of American life, the most powerful asset a person could own was not a stock certificate. It was not a savings account. It was not even gold. It was land. Land was everything. It fed your family. It gave you status. It could be borrowed against, sold, subdivided, and passed down. A man with land had something to stand on, literally and economically. A man without it was dependent on someone else's terms. The new American government understood this. After independence, one of the first major decisions the country made was about land. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 created a system for surveying and selling Western territory. Thousands of square miles were divided into grids, priced, and offered for sale. Land became a market before almost anything else did. Early land speculators were some of the first American investors. They were not buying farms to work. They were buying acreage they had never seen, betting that settlers would follow, towns would grow, and prices would rise. Some made fortunes. Others bought swamp and called it farmland and lost everything. But here is what often goes unmentioned. Much of this land had to be taken first. Native peoples had lived on these territories for generations. Dispossession through war, treaty violation, and forced removal was not a side effect of American land wealth. It was the mechanism. The wealth built on the frontier was, in many cases, built on land that had belonged to someone else. That tension sits at the foundation of the American wealth story. It does not go away if you look closely enough. For ordinary Americans who were not speculators, land wealth was more immediate and practical. A farm was not just a place to live, it was a working asset. The soil produced crops that could be eaten, stored, traded, or sold. Livestock, cattle, hogs, sheep were living inventory. They reproduced, they could be sold, and they could feed a family through a hard winter. A well-stocked barn was a form of savings. Farm equipment mattered too. A good plow, a team of oxen, a functioning wagon. These were capital. Losing them to fire, flood, or theft was a financial disaster. Replacing them required cash or credit that many families did not have. A prosperous farm family in the early 1800s might measure their wealth in acres, animals, stored grain, tools, and labor, their own and that of their children. Their status in the community was visible. You could look at a farm and know roughly how that family was doing. This kind of wealth was also fragile. A bad harvest, a disease that swept through the livestock, a soil-exhausting crop rotation, any of these could erase years of work. There was no insurance. There was no government safety net. You either recovered or you didn't. And if you were enslaved, none of this wealth was yours. Enslaved people built farms, cleared land, grew crops, tended livestock, and generated enormous fortunes for slaveholders, without any legal right to own property, keep wages, or pass wealth to their children. The Southern plantation economy was one of the most productive agricultural systems in American history. The wealth it created belonged entirely to those at the top of a brutal hierarchy. But land was only the beginning. Even in rural America, people needed things they could not grow or make themselves: salt, fabric, tools, medicine, coffee, sugar. And that need created a second engine of American wealth: trade. The general store was the economic center of most American towns. The merchant who ran it was often the wealthiest person in the county, not because he sold goods, but because he controlled credit. Most customers did not pay cash. They ran a tab. They bought on account, promising to settle up after the harvest, or after the cattle sale, or after the timber came down. The merchant recorded everything in a ledger. That ledger was power. It tracked who owed what, who was reliable, and who was a risk. Reputation was a financial instrument. A man known to pay his debts could access more credit. A man known to default found the store's shelves suddenly less available. Trust was underwritten by community knowledge. Everyone knew everyone, and that information shaped who could borrow and who could build. The merchants who grew truly wealthy were those who extended their reach, buying goods wholesale, connecting to ports, shipping along rivers, and linking rural towns to larger markets. Before railroads, water was the highway. Towns on rivers and bays had enormous advantages. Merchants in those towns could accumulate capital faster than inland competitors. That geography translated directly into wealth. Then, paper money created a new problem. Early America had no single national currency. Banks issued their own banknotes, printed paper that represented a promise to pay in gold or silver. But the bank's ability to make good on that promise depended entirely on how well it was managed, how many loans it had out, and whether it had enough hard money in reserve. Hundreds of small banks operated across the country. Some were solid institutions. Others were what critics called wildcat banks. Operations set up in remote locations, backed by little real capital, printing more notes than they could possibly cover. A traveler moving from one state to another might carry banknotes from a dozen different institutions. Some would be accepted at face value, some would be discounted, some were nearly worthless. Bank runs were a regular feature of American economic life. When doubt spread about a bank's solvency, depositors lined up to withdraw. If enough people came at once, the bank could not pay. It failed, and the people holding its notes lost their savings. Financial panics in 1819, in 1837, in 1853, and 1893 wiped out businesses, farms, and families. Wealth was not just risky to build, it was risky to hold. Despite this instability, credit kept the economy moving. Farmers borrowed to plant, merchants borrowed to stock inventory, land speculators borrowed against land they had not yet sold. The American economy ran on debt long before credit scores existed. The question was always the same: who do you trust, and why? The gold rush did not make rich the people you think it did. When gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in California in 1848, tens of thousands of people dropped everything and headed west. They came from the eastern states, from Mexico, from China, from Chile, from Australia. They carried picks and pans and the belief that a fortune was waiting in the ground. A small number of them found it, most did not. The people who reliably got rich during the gold rush were not the miners. They were the suppliers. A merchant named Samuel Brannan bought up every pickaxe and shovel he could find, then publicly announced the gold discovery. Prices for mining equipment jumped instantly. Brannan became one of the wealthiest men in California without ever panning a single ounce. Levi Strauss did not mine gold. He sold durable pants to men who did. Wells Fargo did not dig. It transported gold and provided banking services to those who had found it. The pattern repeated itself across every resource boom in American history: timber, silver, copper, oil. The fortunes usually flowed to those who controlled the infrastructure around the resource, not the resource itself. Land near resource strikes became immensely valuable almost overnight. Those who had bought early, or who had legal claim to land others had overlooked, often walked away wealthy without lifting a tool. Access and timing, again and again, turned out to matter more than labor. The railroad changed everything. Before railroads, American wealth was largely local. A merchant's reach was limited by how far a wagon could travel in a day. A farmer's crops could only be sold where they could be physically transported. Distance was an economic wall. Railroads tore that wall down. A bushel of wheat grown in Illinois could now reach Chicago, then New York, then a ship to Europe, in days instead of weeks. Land near a rail line jumped in value. Land passed over by a rail line often declined. The railroad decided which towns would thrive and which would stagnate. Railroad companies received enormous land grants from the federal government, millions of acres along their routes, given in exchange for building the lines. They sold that land to settlers, used it as collateral for loans, and leveraged it to attract investors. The railroad was not just a transportation technology, it was a financial instrument. To build, railroads issued bonds, promises to pay investors back with interest over time. This drew American and European capital into a new kind of investment. Ordinary people, not just wealthy merchants, began buying railroad securities. The idea that a person could own a piece of a large enterprise rather than just a piece of land started to take hold. This is where Wall Street begins to enter the story. As cities grew, the nature of wealth shifted again. Rural land had made early Americans wealthy. But through the 19th century, urban land became the new prize. Cities were growing fast, fed by immigration, by industrialization, by the railroads pulling commerce toward population centers. A lot purchased in a young city for a few $100s could be worth thousands within a decade. City wealth was different from farm wealth in one important way. You did not have to work it yourself. A building could generate rent. A warehouse could be leased. A storefront could be occupied by a tenant who paid monthly. Real estate in a growing city was a machine that produced income without requiring the owner to do anything beyond owning. This created a landlord class in American cities that accumulated wealth through property rather than labor or production. The pattern was familiar: buy early, hold through growth, sell or rent at a premium. But the scale was new. Urban real estate created fortunes that rivaled anything the old farming economy had produced. The industrial era created a different kind of fortune still. Factories, steel mills, oil refineries, and railroads required enormous amounts of capital to build and operate. They also generated enormous profits for those who owned them. This was ownership wealth at a new scale. A man who owned a steel mill did not swing a hammer. He owned the machine that the men with hammers worked inside. Oil is the clearest example. When petroleum was discovered in western Pennsylvania in the 1850s and 1860s, it sparked a boom that mirrored the gold rush. Drillers rushed in. Most earned modest returns at best. But the men who controlled the refineries, the pipelines, and the distribution networks, who turned raw oil into kerosene and then into a national distribution system, built fortunes that dwarfed anything agriculture had produced. The industrial economy was also ruthlessly unequal in its rewards. Workers in factories and mines labored long hours in dangerous conditions for wages that rarely translated into meaningful savings. The ownership class accumulated. The labor class survived. The gap between them was visible, documented, and contested, but it was the structure of the system. And again, women, Black Americans, recent immigrants, and other groups found legal and social barriers blocking access to the kinds of ownership that generated wealth. Discriminatory lending, exclusion from certain trades, laws restricting property rights for women and non-white citizens, these were not accidents. They were features of the system that kept wealth concentrated among a narrow group. As industrial fortunes grew, something important changed about how wealth was held and transferred. Physical assets, land, livestock, machinery, buildings, were hard to divide and share. You could not sell half a farm easily. You could not split a factory among 100 investors. But paper could be divided as finely as needed. Bonds had existed for a long time. Governments issued them to fund wars. Railroads issued them to build lines. But as the 19th century progressed, corporate shares became more common and more liquid. Stock markets in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia allowed ownership stakes in large enterprises to be bought and sold. At first, this was mostly an elite game. The men trading on Wall Street in the mid-1800s were merchants, financiers, and insiders with access and information. But the infrastructure was being built for something larger. Insurance companies grew. They took in premiums, invested in bonds and mortgages, and created a new pool of patient capital. Savings banks encouraged ordinary people to deposit small amounts and earn interest. Life insurance policies spread the idea that a financial instrument, a piece of paper, could function as a form of security and inheritance. Slowly, cautiously, Americans began to accept that wealth did not have to be physical to be real. A government bond was not a farm, but it represented something of value. A share in a railroad was not a locomotive, but it gave you a claim on the profits. Paper promises, if the institutions behind them were trustworthy, could hold value across time and distance in ways that barrels of grain could not. This shift did not happen cleanly or uniformly. Distrust of banks and paper money ran deep in American culture. Many people, especially in rural areas, held on to the belief that real wealth meant physical things you could touch and work. Politicians built entire careers arguing against central banks, paper currency, and financial abstraction. But the direction of the economy was clear. Large enterprises required large capital. Large capital required financial markets. Financial markets required institutions, regulations, legal frameworks, and eventually a central bank. The American economy was moving, step by step, toward the system we recognize today. By the early 20th century, stocks and bonds had become a legitimate way for middle-class Americans to participate in the economy's growth. The 1920s saw a surge of popular investment in equities. Pension funds, mutual funds, and eventually retirement accounts turned financial markets into a mass institution rather than an elite one. The wealth machine had been rebuilt in paper and code. But its foundations, land, resources, production, credit, and unequal access, were the same ones that had been laid 200 years earlier. Let's be honest about who was excluded from all of this. The American wealth story is not just a story about how people built assets. It is also a story about who was prevented from doing so. Enslaved people generated wealth for others through forced labor and were legally prohibited from owning property, forming contracts, or retaining wages. After emancipation, Black Americans faced convict leasing, sharecropping, discriminatory lending, and systematic exclusion from the land programs, credit systems, and federal benefits that helped white Americans build wealth through the 20th century. Native peoples were dispossessed of land on which they had built economies for generations. Their loss was the direct precondition for much of the land wealth described earlier in the story. Women in early America had limited legal rights to own property independently of their husbands. Married women in many states could not sign contracts, keep their own wages, or hold separate assets until legal reforms arrived gradually through the 19th and 20th centuries. Immigrants from China, Japan, and other countries faced laws explicitly restricting their ability to own land or become citizens. Many immigrant communities were confined to informal economies, denied access to the banks and credit systems that other Americans used to climb. These exclusions were not peripheral to the American wealth story. They shaped who could participate in it, who was exploited by it, and who was locked out of the compounding advantages that turn modest assets into generational security. Understanding how Americans built wealth means understanding both the mechanisms that worked and the barriers that were deliberately constructed. So how did Americans get rich before Wall Street took over? They owned land, often acquired through policies that displaced those already living on it. They farmed, traded, lent, and accumulated physical assets. They built stores, ships, and supply chains around booms that enriched suppliers more than prospectors. They leveraged credit networks built on reputation and community knowledge. They speculated on frontier land, railroad routes, and urban growth. They owned factories, refineries, and the infrastructure of an industrializing nation. And gradually, they accepted that paper. Bonds, shares, insurance policies, bank deposits could represent real wealth if the institutions behind it were stable enough to be trusted. Each of these systems rewarded those who arrived early, knew the terrain, had access to capital, and faced fewer legal and social barriers. None of them were fair, none of them were simple. And all of them together formed the foundation on which modern American finance was eventually built. Wall Street did not invent American wealth. It formalized it, abstracted it, and made it tradable. The land became a stock certificate. The factory became equity, the oil well became a share price, the railroad became a bond, the physical became financial, the local became national, the tangible became a number on a screen. But the number on the screen still points back to something real: land, labor, resources, credit, and the question of who gets access to them. Before America became a nation of investors, it was a nation of landowners, farmers, merchants, lenders, speculators, railroad builders, shopkeepers, oilmen, factory owners, workers, debtors, and people trying to turn whatever they controlled into security. The old American wealth system was not simple, it was not fair, and it was not safe. But it explains something important. Money is never just money. It is a system for deciding who controls land, labor, risk, trust, and the future. That was true in 1790, it was true in 1870, it was true in 1929, and it is still true today.